Well, this is what was a very strong evidence why we have to know our history. Because as you already saw in just one slide, something that has been told by the father of medicine 1,000 years ago, something that's the future in the medicine. So everybody knows that when we know history, the deep knowledge of history is something that we can help us to predict, evaluate, and treat present and future difficult situation. I don't want to take any more of the time because we're already, as I had already told, we're late. So I would like to ask Professor Stefanos Geroulanos, who is a very well-known person. He's professor of surgery in Switzerland, University of Zurich, and he's also professor, emeritus professor in history of medicine in University of Ioannina, and president of the International Central Committee of the International Hippocratic Foundation, also chair of the Medicine Academy of Letters and Sciences in Cambridge. So I would like to ask Professor Geroulanos to give us the lecture that will try to introduce us in the current pandemic by referring us 1,000 years ago to the age of Pericles and the Prehippocratic area, the epidemics and the plague pattern. Dear Professor, we are delighted to hear you.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know why I don't have any slides on. My professor coming. Hello, can you hear me from the studio?
Can we help Professor for the presentation?
Hello?
Can you share us, Professor? Can you use the button in the bottom, the share screen?
I have the share screen. I push it. It says share the screen. Now something is coming. That's better. But it's still not coming, the slides. You're in the show. Something wrong with it.
We cannot see anything.
I can't see anything. That's why I've...
Please, Mr. Geroulanos, you must bring your PowerPoint in front of you so that
I have it in
see.
front of me. I can bring it.
Okay, bring it in front of you so that you can see it and have it in full mode presentation, please.
Okay, fine. And I don't see myself. Never mind.
No, you don't see yourself. Okay. Full mode presentation, please.
No problem. Mr. President, esteemed Chair, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the International Hippocratic Foundation, I would like to thank the President of the Global Doctors Hippocratic Institute, Mr. Patoulis, for organizing this fantastic Congress and give us the opportunity to be today together and show to the world how important are still today the doctrines of Hippocrates, of course. The first epidemic that we know is smallpox. It has killed just in the 20th century 300 million people. Everybody speaks about the Spanish flu with 25 million people, but smallpox was even worse. It is the first epidemic that ever was documented back in 10,000 BC. It is responsible for the first treaty on earth. Effective prevention was already in China on the 4th century, taking crusts, making powder of it and putting in the nostrils of children. We have the first effective immunization by Ipilarinos antimonis. We have a mass immunization of an army by variolation of George Washington in 1777. We have the first vaccination with venom Jenner on 1796, and the completely eradicated viral disease since 1980. It's the biggest achievement in international public health. But let's start to see how this started. The first recorded smallpox epidemic was in the 13th century BC during the Egyptian Hittite Wars. It was the biggest battle that ever existed, with about 5,000 chariots on each side. We see here Ramses II on his chariot. The chariots of the Egyptians were much lighter. The Hittites had 3 persons on the chariot, and the Hittites were winning, but at the end, some help came from Egypt. So the Hittites had to go into the town of and their king and their vice king died from smallpox. The Egyptians were so afraid that they disappeared. However, some years later, they had a treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians. We see here it is the first written treaty of peace on earth due to smallpox that the both sides accepted that they will not go against each other. The first time that we have a lesion, that we have seen a lesion, is on the head of the Pharaoh Ramses V, who died 1143. The variolation that I mentioned before goes back to the Buddhists and to China. However, it was already common practice already on the 4th century. Smallpox, despite that, had killed millions of people for every century, billions of people. And by the end of the 15th century, a new method of variolation was common practice in the East. Iacovos Pylarinos speaks 1714 from a Byzantine method. We don't know anything in Byzantium. And he says that he learned the method from an old Thessalian woman in 6070. He has published that on 1714 at the Philosophical Transactions in London, and speaking that in Byzantinum tandem irepsit urbem, what was very often in the Byzantine towns. I do not want to underestimate the help of Lady Wortley Montagu, the wife of the ambassador to Turkey, who inoculated her son by Emmanuel Timonis in Constantinople. And she persuaded then the British to do it. I apologize, but it doesn't close the ones that shouldn't be seen. I just show you here when Washington went to take over Canada and liberate Canada, there were killed in war only 1,000. 1,200 were wounded, but died from smallpox 10,000 of his army and deserted 25. I mean, they are unbelievable data. And then he thought of immunizing his army. And he asked his servant if he was already past the smallpox. And he said, yes, I have had a little thing on my shoulder and I cannot get ill. So he asked him who was that. It was Cotton Father, a physician in South Carolina, and he variolated his whole army and fell into Philadelphia and into Boston. And like that, thanks to Pylarinos and Timonis, USA was liberated. It's few people that know that these two guys, the one from Chios, the other from Cephalonia, were the ones that propagated. The book of Pylarinos was translated in 15 languages in less than 10 years. The variolation ended the British colonization of North America. It was the biggest achievement, as I said, in public health, but it was Jenner that had the last way of the vaccination. He was the first to introduce vaccination. Let's hope that the anti-COVID vaccination will be soon equally effective. The other epidemic that goes back to Homer is the Achaean epidemic. We do not know exactly what it was, but it was the son of Hippocrates, of Asclepius, the Podalirios, that was asked to fight it, and he put a lot of fires. Ancient Greeks believed that Apollo was sending the illness with his arrows, and that's why the one next to the other did not catch it. But they didn't know anything yet about the bacteria, it is clear. So it was the son of Asclepius that put a lot of fires around the city of Troia. They burned all the deads, they burned the clothes, so probably the lice were burned too, and like that, the epidemic was eliminated. Plague is one of the biggest epidemics and pandemics we had. We found in skeletons Yersinia around 5000 BC. You see, just over Eurasia, we have a lot of graves with skeletons that have people died from plague. But the first recorded is in the Old Testament, in the book of Samuel, and it's called the Plague of the Philistines. There it starts by rats that were coming out in town. So they were dying on the streets, and female rats came out, gave birth to the little ones, and died on the streets. And just after that, the plague started. And the Philistines thought it is because we have invaded Jerusalem and they have taken the cask that was the 10 Commandments of Moses were in. So they have sent it back to the Jews in order to be freed of the pandemic. But after 6 days, practically, most of the Israelis in the temple died, and the epidemic was gone to the Israelis. The first to describe plague, lepra and erysipelas, was Rufus, and a huge plague was the so-called Tandonian Plague at Gallant's time, or Gallant Plague, where Gallant refused to go with his friend to Vienna, where the Germans have come down and crossed the Danube. There, Mark Aurel died. Gallant, that stayed in a village around Rome, survived. But the important thing was that by that death of Marcus Aurelius, the end of the Pax Romana was there, and a lot of people moved into Europe. Another plague that changed history is the Justinian Plague. Justinianus lived between 525 and 565. And in the first half of his reign, he was able to restitute the Roman Empire, now as Byzantine Empire. But in the middle of his reign, the plague came. 50% of the subjects of Byzantium died. And on the same time, in 571, Muhammad was born. And in the next year, all this place, due to the plague, was able for the Muslims for the Islamic religion to conquer the towns. Even in Damas, when they went to conquer Damas and they saw that they had a plague, the Quran says, if a city had an endemic, there is God that tries to kill the infidels, so go away and return after sometimes. So they went back to the desert for the 9 years, and when they returned to Damascus, the people opened the doors and there was no war. And like that, it was pretty easy after such a bad pandemic to conquer more or less the whole north of Africa. Hippocrates mentioned several epidemic diseases, and the most beautiful one is Parotitis Epidemica, that describes it beautifully. He was believing that the infection was going through the air and also from man to man, that the one person could infect the others. We call this droplets today. He didn't know it exactly that they were droplets, but he was already thinking that it was in the air, the bacteria. And look how he describes this epidemic. Many had swellings beside one ear or both ears. All the swelling subsided without causing a harm. Sufferers were young men and men in their prime. They had dry coughs which brought nothing up, and after sometimes painful inflammations occurred either in one testicle or both. Even the orchitis is described by Hippocrates. Up to the 50s, we could find this description in practically all pediatric books. Now it is copied and nobody says who has written it. Last, the epidemic of Athens. At the Peloponnesian War in 430, a plague struck the city of Athens, which was then under siege by Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. In the next 3 years, most of the population was infected, and perhaps as many as 55,000 to 100,000 people died. It was 25% of the population. The description is terrible. It is like the Boccaccio's the Caimeron that describes the same things. The bodies of dying men lay one upon the other. The sacred places were full of corpses. They buried the bodies as best as they could. Sometimes they threw their own dead body upon the strangest pyre, etc. He describes also the system and the symptoms, but nobody was able to say clearly what it was. We were thinking of typhus, but it was not clear. Today, we know the presence of Hippocrates, that a lot of people think that he was there to cure it, is not clear. There is a letter that says that he went there, and there is also the Athenians have given him a prize and said that he would, and his children can come and eat in the Prytaneum, which was a very big honor to him. But we have no clear evidence. Most probably he has sent his children, and they lighted also fires like Podalirios had done in the War of Troy. Now today, through the DNA, we were able to certify the illness. It was Salmonella enterica, very close to Salmonella typhimurium. This was isolated in the teeth of people of a mass grave of around 400 persons in Keramikos. What is the message of today? A pandemic with a virulent bug is extremely dangerous, but the combination of two is disastrous. If a second bug comes on COVID-19 on, it will be disastrous. Eventually, only an epidemic of flu, H1 and N1, could be of terrific mortality. And that's why we have to make our vaccinations not only against the COVID, but also as many as polio. I show you just one slide to realize what happens when two infections are coming together. Napoleon's army left Paris with 600,000. When they arrived in Poland, it was the typhus exanthematicus there. And when they reached Russia, already 50% were dead. But in 2 weeks, another 100,000 died due of cholera. And then we had a small battle with only 8,000 deaths. The other 20,000 are again the infection. He enters in Moscow on the 14th of December, 100,000. End of October, there are only 30,000. There is a battle in Berenzina with another 10,000 deaths. The other 20s are from the cholera and the typhus. And then they decided to return, and only 1,000 arrived in Paris. You can imagine what this means when you have two, or even as it is three together. We have the typhus exanthematicus, we have the cholera and the cold that killed 550,000 out of 600, and only 30 to 40,000 were killed in the battles. It wasn't the enemy soldiers that devastated Napoleon's army. Soldiers were battle-hardened young people, but it was the microscopic organism that did it. Ladies and gentlemen, the message of Hippocrates for today is prophylaxis is much better than therapy. Thank you very much for your attendance.
We thank you, Professor, for the very short but complete presentation that referred to many major epidemic events during the human history. I think that any questions or comments should be kept for the end of the presentation. And I would like to give the speech now to my co-president, Professor Antonios Polidoro, and I would like also, before giving the speech, to thank him personally for the great honor to be with you today.